I am Isla Thompson, 28 years old, and I discovered I was adopted in the most public, humiliating way possible during my sister's wedding reception in front of 200 guests when she casually mentioned it in her maid of honor speech. The secret my parents had guarded for nearly 3 decades spilled out in a single, careless sentence that would tear our family apart and bring Child Protective Services to our door. What happened next would force us all to confront truths we'd spent years avoiding.
I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. Growing up in Riverside, California, our family looked like something straight out of a magazine. The Thompson household was the kind neighbors pointed to as an example of how things should be done. Our two-story colonial house with its perfectly manicured lawn sat at the end of Maple Street, complete with white picket fence and my mother's prize-winning rose garden that she tended every morning before her nursing shift at Riverside General Hospital. My parents, David and Margaret Thompson, had been high school sweethearts who married young and built what everyone considered the ideal American family. Dad worked as a project manager for a construction company, methodical and reliable in everything he did. Mom was the kind of woman who color-coordinated our school lunches and never missed a parent-teacher conference. They were active in the community, volunteered at church functions, and hosted elaborate 4th of July barbecues that the entire neighborhood attended. My sister Emma was born when I was 3 years old, though I have no memory of life before her arrival. She came into the world as what my parents often called their miracle baby, a term that always made me feel slightly uncomfortable, though I could never articulate why. Emma was everything parents dream of: easygoing, naturally gifted, and blessed with the kind of effortless charm that made adults light up when she walked into a room. From my earliest memories, Emma and I were inseparable. She had thick auburn hair that caught sunlight like copper wire, bright green eyes that sparkled with mischief, and a gap-toothed smile that could convince our parents to let us have ice cream for breakfast. I was the protective older sister, always making sure she didn't wander too far from our yard, helping her tie her shoes, and reading her bedtime stories in funny voices that made her giggle until Mom had to come upstairs and tell us to settle down. Our childhood was filled with traditions that seemed to bind us together as an unbreakable unit. Saturday mornings meant pancakes shaped like animals, Dad flipping them high in the air while Emma and I squealed with delight. Sunday afternoons were reserved for family bike rides through Riverside's tree-lined neighborhoods, stopping for ice cream at Mel's Dairy on 5th Street. Every Christmas Eve, we'd pile into Dad's truck to drive around looking at holiday lights, hot chocolate steaming from our thermoses, Christmas carols playing softly on the radio. Emma and I shared everything: clothes, secrets, dreams about our futures. We built elaborate forts in the backyard using old sheets and garden chairs, created detailed plans for the treehouse Dad promised to build but never quite got around to, and spent countless summer evenings catching fireflies in mason jars, making wishes before releasing them back into the warm California air. School came naturally to both of us, though in different ways. I excelled in English and history, losing myself in stories and essays, while Emma had a mathematical mind that solved complex problems like they were simple puzzles. Our parents attended every school play, science fair, and award ceremony, beaming with pride as they watched their daughters succeed. They kept a photo wall in the hallway documenting our achievements: spelling bee ribbons, soccer team pictures, honor roll certificates, a visual testament to their parenting success. The extended family gatherings were some of my happiest memories. Thanksgiving at Grandma Betty's house in San Bernardino brought together aunts, uncles, and cousins from across Southern California. Grandma Betty, Dad's mother, was a tiny woman with silver hair who made the best apple pie in 3 counties and told stories about the old days that kept us kids mesmerized for hours. She had a special way of making each grandchild feel like her absolute favorite, slipping us extra cookies when our parents weren't looking and letting us stay up past bedtime to watch old movies. Mom's parents, Grandpa Joe and Grandma Rose, lived in a retirement community in Palm Springs and visited every few months. Grandpa Joe always brought presents, usually books for me and science kits for Emma, and Grandma Rose would spend hours teaching us card games and sharing family recipes that she insisted we write down in our special cookbook. During these family gatherings, I sometimes caught fragments of conversations that seemed to stop abruptly when I walked into the room. Adult voices would lower to whispers, and someone would quickly change the subject when they noticed me listening. At the time, I assumed it was typical grown-up talk about boring things like mortgages and medical bills. The idea that these hushed conversations might concern me never crossed my mind. The Amos T. Emma and I had our differences, of course. She was naturally more outgoing, making friends easily wherever we went, while I tended to be more reserved, preferring smaller groups and quieter activities. She loved being the center of attention, performing impromptu dance routines in our living room and convincing our parents to let her enter local talent shows. I was content to be her audience, cheering from the sidelines and helping her practice her routines. Our parents seemed to understand and appreciate these differences. They encouraged Emma's performances while nurturing my love of reading and writing. They never made us feel like we had to be the same person or compete with each other for their attention. In fact, they often praised us for being such different individuals who complemented each other so well. High school brought new challenges and opportunities. Emma threw herself into student government and drama club, quickly becoming one of the most popular girls in her class. She dated the quarterback, organized school dances, and somehow managed to maintain perfect grades while juggling a dozen extracurricular activities. I found my niche with the school newspaper and debate team, preferring the satisfaction of researching complex topics and crafting compelling arguments. I was content to be her audience, cheering from the sidelines and helping her practice her routines. Our parents seemed to understand and appreciate these differences. They encouraged Emma's performances while nurturing my love of reading and writing. They never made us feel like we had to be the same person or compete with each other for their attention. In fact, they often praised us for being such different individuals who complemented each other so well. High school brought new challenges and opportunities. Emma threw herself into student government and drama club, quickly becoming one of the most popular girls in her class. She dated the quarterback, organized school dances, and somehow managed to maintain perfect grades while juggling a dozen extracurricular activities. I found my niche with the school newspaper and debate team, preferring the satisfaction of researching complex topics and crafting compelling arguments. High school brought new challenges and opportunities. Emma threw herself into student government and drama club, quickly becoming one of the most popular girls in her class. She dated the quarterback, organized school dances, and somehow managed to maintain perfect grades while juggling a dozen extracurricular activities. I found my niche with the school newspaper and debate team, preferring the satisfaction of researching complex topics and crafting compelling arguments.
Our parents adapted their support to our individual paths. They attended every football game where Emma cheered and every debate tournament where I competed. They helped fund Emma's elaborate promposal ideas and drove across the state when my debate team made it to regionals. Their love felt unconditional and equally distributed, never favoring one daughter over the other. College planning brought the first real test of our family's strength. Emma had her heart set on UCLA, drawn by their communications program and the promise of staying relatively close to home. I was accepted to Northwestern University in Illinois, excited by their journalism program but nervous about moving so far from family. Our parents supported both decisions without question, though I could see the sadness in Mom's eyes when she thought about me living halfway across the country. The night before I left for Northwestern, Emma crawled into my bed like she used to when we were little and thunderstorms kept her awake. We talked until sunrise about everything and nothing. Her fears about not being smart enough for UCLA, my worries about making friends in a new place, our promises to call each other every week and visit during breaks. "Promise me we'll always be close," Emma whispered as dawn light started filtering through my bedroom curtains. "Promise me nothing will ever change between us." I hugged her tight, breathing in the familiar scent of her vanilla shampoo. Nothing could ever change us, Em. We're sisters. That's forever. The words felt true and permanent, like a vow that could withstand any test. How could I have known that this promise would be broken not by distance or time, but by a truth that had been hidden in plain sight our entire lives? How could I have predicted that the very foundation of our sisterhood, our shared blood, our shared history, our shared identity as Thompson daughters, was built on a lie that would eventually crumble in the most public way imaginable? But that night, curled up together in my childhood bedroom, surrounded by boxes packed for college and walls covered with photos of our perfect family moments, the future seemed as solid and predictable as the sunrise. We were the Thompson sisters, bound by love and blood and years of shared memories. Nothing could change that. Or so we believed. College marked the beginning of subtle changes that I didn't recognize as significant at the time. Northwestern University opened up a world of possibilities I'd never imagined, surrounded by students from diverse backgrounds with stories that made my suburban California upbringing seem almost quaint. My roommate, Jessica, was from Chicago's South Side and had overcome challenges I could barely comprehend. Down the hall lived Maria, whose parents had immigrated from Guatemala when she was 5, and Sarah, who'd aged out of the foster care system but managed to earn a full scholarship through sheer determination. Listening to their stories during late-night conversations in our dorm, I began to feel oddly disconnected from my own narrative. While they spoke passionately about overcoming adversity, fighting for opportunities, and defying expectations, my biggest struggle seemed to be homesickness and deciding on a major. Their resilience made my comfortable childhood feel almost embarrassingly easy, though I couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing from my own story, some piece I couldn't identify. During my sophomore year, I took a genetics class as an elective, thinking it would satisfy my science requirement with minimal effort. Professor Martinez was a passionate educator who made complex concepts accessible through real-world examples. When we studied inheritance patterns, she encouraged us to trace our own family traits as a homework assignment. It seemed simple enough: map eye color, hair texture, blood type, and other observable characteristics through our family trees. I called home excitedly to gather information, thinking this would be a fun way to connect with my parents and learn more about our family history. Mom seemed hesitant when I explained the assignment, asking several times if it was really necessary for my grade. When I pressed for details about blood types and medical history, she became evasive, claiming she didn't remember such specifics and suggesting I focus on more obvious traits, like eye color. "You have your father's nose," she said, redirecting the conversation, and Emma got my stubborn streak, though she'd never admit it.
A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. The deflection felt strange, but I attributed it to her busy work schedule. Mom had always been the type to compartmentalize information, keeping medical details private unless absolutely necessary. I managed to complete the assignment with the limited information I had, though it left me with more questions than answers. Spring break of my junior year brought an unexpected revelation during a casual conversation with Grandma Betty. I was helping her organize old photo albums when she pulled out a picture of Dad as a baby, remarking on how much he looked like Emma at the same age. The comment struck me as odd, since I'd always thought Emma and I resembled each other more than either of us looked like our parents. "What did I look like as a baby?" I asked, flipping through the albums for comparison photos. Grandma Betty paused, her hands hovering over a particular page. "You were beautiful, sweetheart. Absolutely beautiful. Such a serious little face, like you were contemplating the mysteries of the universe." She showed me a few baby pictures, but something about her response felt rehearsed, as if she'd prepared this answer for a question she'd been expecting. The photos themselves seemed oddly sparse compared to the extensive documentation of Emma's early years. When I mentioned this observation, Grandma Betty explained that they'd lost some pictures in a movie, though her explanation felt rushed and unconvincing.
Back at school, I found myself paying closer attention to genetics lectures, particularly the sections on inheritance patterns and family resemblance. Professor Martinez discussed how certain traits skip generations, how recessive genes can surprise families, and how genetic diversity within families is actually quite common. Yet something nagged at me about my own family's genetic makeup. Emma's auburn hair and green eyes were strikingly similar to Mom's coloring, while I had darker hair and brown eyes that didn't quite match either parent. Dad's family leaned toward blonde hair and blue eyes, making my appearance something of an anomaly. When I mentioned this to Jessica, she laughed and said genetics could be unpredictable, pointing out her own mixed heritage as evidence of how complex family resemblance could be. The summer before my senior year, I worked as an intern at the Riverside Tribune, eager to gain journalism experience close to home. The internship involved everything from covering city council meetings to writing feature stories about local residents. One assignment particularly stood out, a piece about the county's adoption services and the challenges facing children in the foster care system. Interviewing social workers and adoptive families opened my eyes to complexities I'd never considered. I listened to stories of children who'd found loving homes after difficult beginnings, families who'd grown through adoption, and the various reasons parents might choose to keep adoption details private. Some families were completely open about their adoption stories, while others preferred to handle such information more privately, especially when children were very young. The assignment required research into local adoption statistics and procedures. I spent hours at the courthouse reviewing public records and familiarizing myself with how the system worked. The process was more complex than I'd imagined, involving multiple agencies, extensive background checks, and careful matching procedures designed to ensure the best outcomes for children. During one interview, a social worker named Mrs. Chen mentioned how adoption had evolved over the decades. In the past, there was often more secrecy around adoption, she explained. Families sometimes believed it was easier for children if they never knew about their origins. Today, we understand that openness and honesty generally produce healthier outcomes. Her words resonated with me in a way I couldn't fully explain. That evening, I called home to share details about my article, describing the interviews and research I'd conducted. Mom listened quietly, asking a few questions, which seemed unusual given her typical interest in my work. When I mentioned Mrs. Chen's comments about secrecy versus openness, there was a long pause before Mom changed the subject to Emma's upcoming senior year at UCLA. Emma and I had maintained our close relationship despite the distance, talking weekly and texting almost daily. She was thriving in her communications program, had landed a coveted internship with a Los Angeles television station, and was dating someone serious for the first time. Her life seemed to be unfolding exactly as she'd planned, each milestone celebrated by our proud parents who shared every achievement with anyone willing to listen. Our phone conversations were filled with plans for my graduation, Emma's upcoming internship, and her increasingly serious relationship with Michael Rodriguez, a fellow UCLA student studying business. She'd been dating Michael for 8 months and spoke about him with the kind of excitement that suggested this relationship was different from her previous casual college romances. "I think he might be the one," she confided during one of our late-night calls. "I know it sounds crazy since we're so young, but everything feels so right with him. He wants to meet the whole family over Thanksgiving." The prospect of bringing Michael home for the holidays excited our parents, who had always encouraged Emma's relationships while respecting her independence. They'd video chatted with him several times and approved of his ambition, his respect for Emma, and his apparent genuine affection for their daughter. As my senior year progressed, I found myself thinking more frequently about family, legacy, and the stories that bind us together. My journalism classes emphasized the importance of truth, accuracy, and the responsibility that comes with uncovering and sharing information. These principles began to feel increasingly relevant to my own life, though I couldn't pinpoint exactly why. During winter break, I noticed small inconsistencies in family stories that I'd never questioned before. Photo albums seemed to have gaps I'd never noticed, family friends made comments that didn't quite align with the timeline I remembered, and certain relatives seemed to phrase things carefully when discussing my early childhood.
These observations were subtle, like pieces of a puzzle that didn't quite fit together, but individually seemed insignificant. The most unsettling moment came during Christmas dinner, when Grandpa Joe mentioned something about my homecoming being such a blessing for the family. When I asked what he meant, he seemed flustered and claimed he was simply referring to my birth. But the word choice felt deliberate and strange, creating an uncomfortable silence that Mom quickly filled by asking him to carve the turkey. That night, lying in my childhood bedroom surrounded by posters and mementos from high school, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental about my understanding of our family was incomplete. It wasn't anything I could articulate or prove, just a persistent sense that the story I'd been told about my place in the Thompson family wasn't the complete truth.
The spring semester of my senior year brought graduation preparations, job applications, and increasing anxiety about the future. I'd been accepted to several graduate journalism programs and had received a few promising job offers from newspapers in different cities. Each opportunity represented a chance to build my own life and career, but also meant continued distance from the family that had always been my anchor. Emma, meanwhile, was planning her own post-graduation future with increasing certainty. She and Michael had been talking about marriage, though they planned to wait until after graduation to get engaged. Her excitement about their relationship was infectious, and she'd already started dropping hints about wanting me to be her maid of honor when the time came. "Promise me you'll say yes when I ask," she said during one of our weekend calls. "I can't imagine getting married without my sister standing beside me." The request felt like both an honor and a responsibility. Being Emma's maid of honor would mean helping plan her wedding, supporting her through one of the most important days of her life, and publicly celebrating the bond we'd shared since childhood. It was a role I'd always assumed I'd play, just as she would undoubtedly be my maid of honor when my time came. As graduation approached, I felt caught between excitement for the future and reluctance to leave behind the certainty of my family identity. The vague unease that had been building throughout college remained unresolved, a background hum of questions I couldn't quite formulate. Something about my place in the Thompson family story felt incomplete, but I had no concrete reason to doubt the narrative I'd grown up with. The summer after graduation would bring changes I couldn't anticipate, revelations that would shatter everything I believed about my identity, and truths that had been carefully hidden for nearly 3 decades. But in those final weeks of college, surrounded by classmates celebrating their achievements and planning their futures, I still believed in the solid foundation of my family's love and the unbreakable bond between Emma and me. I had no way of knowing that the foundation was built on secrets that would soon be exposed in the most public and devastating way possible. The year following my graduation brought a whirlwind of changes that temporarily pushed my nagging doubts to the background. I'd accepted a position as a junior reporter at the Portland Tribune in Oregon, drawn by their commitment to investigative journalism and the opportunity to cover stories that mattered. The move to Portland represented my first real independence, living in a cramped studio apartment in the Pearl District and navigating the challenges of adult life without family nearby. My new job consumed most of my energy and attention. I covered everything from city budget meetings to environmental protests, slowly building my reputation as a thorough and reliable journalist. The work was demanding but fulfilling, requiring long hours and constant learning. My editor, Janet Morrison, was a veteran journalist who pushed her reporters to dig deeper, ask harder questions, and never accept surface explanations. "The truth is rarely convenient," Janet told me during one of our early meetings. "People will give you the easy story, the comfortable version of events. Your job is to find what they're not telling you." Her words echoed in my mind constantly, shaping how I approached every assignment. This investigative mindset began influencing how I viewed the world beyond work, making me more attentive to inconsistencies and gaps in the stories people told. It was an occupational hazard that would soon prove both blessing and curse. Emma's life was progressing exactly as she'd planned. She'd landed a coveted position at a prestigious public relations firm in Los Angeles after graduation, quickly establishing herself as a rising star in their media relations department.
Her relationship with Michael had deepened into something solid and committed, and their engagement announcement came via a video call that left our entire family in tears of joy. "We're thinking next spring," Emma said, her engagement ring sparkling even through the pixelated video connection. "Something romantic, but not too elaborate, maybe in Napa Valley or along the coast." Our parents were ecstatic, immediately offering to help with planning and expenses. Dad started researching venues, while Mom began collecting wedding magazines and Pinterest boards. The engagement transformed every family conversation into wedding-related discussions, from guest lists to flower arrangements to menu selections. When Emma asked me to be her maid of honor, the request came with a level of emotion that surprised me. We were having lunch at her favorite cafe in Santa Monica during one of my visits home, and she suddenly became teary-eyed as she made the official request. "I need you to promise me something," she said, gripping my hands across the small table. "I need you to promise that nothing will ever come between us. Not distance, not time, not anything. We're sisters, and that means everything to me." The intensity of her request struck me as unusual. Emma had always been sentimental, but this felt different, more urgent, as if she was worried about something. When I asked what prompted such concern, she claimed it was just wedding emotions and the stress of planning such an important event. Planning the wedding became a family project that consumed the better part of 8 months. Emma wanted something elegant but personal, incorporating meaningful elements that reflected her relationship with Michael and her connection to our family. She chose the Chateau du Soreo in Yosemite, a romantic location that required extensive coordination but promised stunning photographs and an unforgettable experience. My role as maid of honor involved numerous trips to California for dress fittings, venue visits, and planning sessions. During these visits, I noticed our parents seemed unusually invested in every detail, as if this wedding represented more than just their daughter's happiness. Mom threw herself into planning with an intensity that bordered on obsession, creating elaborate spreadsheets and timelines that tracked every aspect of the celebration.
"This needs to be perfect," Mom said repeatedly during planning sessions. "Emma deserves everything to be absolutely perfect." The emphasis on perfection felt excessive, even for a mother of the bride. When I mentioned this to Dad during a quiet moment, he brushed off my observation, claiming Mom was simply excited about Emma's happiness. But his explanation didn't address the underlying tension I sensed, a current of anxiety that seems disproportionate to normal wedding stress. 3 months before the wedding, I was assigned to cover a story about identity theft and document fraud, an investigation that took me deep into the world of falsified records and stolen identities. The assignment required hours at government offices, learning about birth certificates, social security records, and the various ways official documents could be manipulated or misrepresented. During my research, I discovered how surprisingly easy it was to alter or replace official documents, particularly for events that occurred decades ago when record-keeping was less sophisticated. A contact at the county clerk's office explained how adoption records were often sealed and how families sometimes received amended birth certificates that reflected adoptive parents rather than biological ones. "Most people never question their birth certificates," the clerk explained. "They assume the document they've always seen is the original, but there are often multiple versions depending on circumstances." The conversation stuck with me for reasons I couldn't fully articulate. That evening, I found myself thinking about my own birth certificate, wondering if I'd ever actually seen it, or if I was simply assuming its contents based on what I'd been told. The thought seemed paranoid and unreasonable, but once planted, it grew into a persistent curiosity I couldn't ignore. A week later, while visiting home for Emma's bridal shower, I mentioned my recent assignment to our family during dinner. I described the complexities of document verification and the surprising prevalence of identity-related fraud. As I spoke, I noticed Dad had stopped eating, his fork suspended halfway to his mouth, while Mom's face had gone pale. "That sounds like fascinating work," Dad said carefully, "but rather depressing to think about how dishonest some people can be." Mom nodded in agreement, but her response felt rehearsed, as if she'd prepared for this type of conversation.
When I mentioned the clerk's comments about birth certificates and adoption records, both parents seemed to find their food very interesting, avoiding eye contact and changing the subject to wedding flower arrangements. The bridal shower itself was a beautiful event that Mom had planned with military precision. Friends and relatives gathered at our house to celebrate Emma's upcoming marriage, sharing stories and advice while she opened an impressive collection of gifts. The afternoon should have been purely joyful, but I found myself observing family interactions with the analytical eye I developed through journalism. Several relatives made comments that seemed oddly phrased or carefully worded. Aunt Linda mentioned how blessed our family was that Emma had found her way to us, which struck me as an unusual way to describe a birth daughter. Cousin Sarah talked about how Emma and I were meant to be sisters, as if our relationship was a matter of choice rather than biology. Most unsettling was a conversation I accidentally overheard between Mom and Grandma Betty in the kitchen. They were discussing wedding logistics when Grandma Betty said something about hoping everything stays peaceful and that some secrets are better left buried. When they noticed me approaching, they immediately shifted to discussing catering details, but their sudden change in demeanor was unmistakable. That evening, after the shower guests had departed and Emma had gone out with college friends, I found myself alone with our parents for the first time in months. We were cleaning up the aftermath of the party when I decided to address the strange comments I'd been noticing. "People said some interesting things today," I began, stacking gift boxes. "A lot of comments about how lucky our family is, how blessed we are that things worked out the way they did." Dad continued loading the dishwasher without responding, while Mom busied herself wiping already clean counters. The silence stretched uncomfortably long before Mom finally spoke. "People say all sorts of things at weddings and showers," she said dismissively. "You know how sentimental these events make everyone." Her explanation was reasonable on the surface, but something about her tone suggested she was working hard to appear casual. When I pressed for clarification about specific comments, both parents seemed eager to end the conversation, claiming exhaustion from the day's events. 2 weeks before the wedding, Emma called me in an unusual state of agitation. She'd been going through old family photos for a wedding slideshow when she noticed the same discrepancies I'd observed years earlier. The sparse documentation of my early childhood compared to her extensively photographed infancy. "Don't you think it's weird that there are so few pictures of you as a baby?" she asked. "Mom always says she was too busy with a newborn to take many photos, but that doesn't really make sense when you look at how many pictures she took of me."
Her observation validated concerns I'd been harboring but hadn't wanted to voice directly. We spent an hour on the phone comparing memories and timelines, trying to piece together explanations for the gaps and inconsistencies we'd both noticed but never discussed. "Maybe I'm being paranoid because of all the wedding stress," Emma said finally, "but something feels off about the stories we've been told about our early childhood." Her admission was both relieving and terrifying. If Emma, who had always been the favored daughter with no reason to question her place in the family, was noticing the same inconsistencies, then perhaps my concerns weren't simply the product of an overactive journalistic mind. The conversation ended without resolution, but it marked a turning point in how we both viewed our family narrative. We'd crossed from unconscious acceptance to conscious questioning, though neither of us was prepared for where that questioning would ultimately lead. 1 week before the wedding, as final preparations consumed everyone's attention, I made a decision that would change everything. Driven by professional instincts and personal curiosity I could no longer ignore, I submitted a formal request for my birth certificate from Riverside County. The process was simple, a standard form and small fee that would provide me with an official copy of the document that established my legal identity. As I dropped the request form in the mail, I felt simultaneously relieved and terrified. Within days, I would have concrete documentation that would either put my concerns to rest or confirm that the foundation of my identity was built on lies. The wedding was approaching rapidly, promising to be a beautiful celebration of Emma and Michael's love. But lurking beneath the excitement and anticipation was a growing sense that this joyful event might also become the moment when long-buried truths finally surfaced.
I had no way of knowing that the birth certificate I'd requested would never arrive, and that the truth about my identity would be revealed not through official documentation, but through my sister's own words, spoken in front of 200 wedding guests who would witness the moment our family's carefully constructed facade finally crumbled. The morning of Emma's wedding dawned with the kind of perfect California sunshine that photographers dream about. The Château du Sirop was transformed into a fairy tale setting, with white roses cascading from every available surface and string lights creating a magical ambiance that would photograph beautifully against the Yosemite backdrop. I arrived early with the other bridesmaids to help Emma prepare for the most important day of her life. Emma's bridal suite was a flurry of activity: hairstylists, makeup artists, photographers, and bridesmaids all working in choreographed chaos to create the perfect wedding morning. Emma sat in the center of it all, radiant in her silk robe, her auburn hair being transformed into an elegant updo that would complement her grandmother's vintage pearl necklace. "I can't believe this is actually happening," she whispered to me during a quiet moment while the photographer adjusted lighting. "I keep thinking I'm going to wake up and discover this is all a dream." Her excitement was infectious, but I noticed an underlying nervousness that seemed to go beyond typical pre-wedding jitters. She kept checking her phone, looking toward the door as if expecting someone who hadn't arrived, and her hands trembled slightly as the makeup artist applied her lipstick. "Everything okay?" I asked, squeezing her hand reassuringly. "Just nervous," she replied, but her smile didn't reach her eyes. "You know how I get when I'm the center of attention for something this important." The bridesmaids, Emma's college roommate Madison, her coworker Jessica, and our cousin Lily, were handling their roles with enthusiasm and efficiency. Madison had appointed herself unofficial coordinator, making sure everyone stayed on schedule and looked perfect. Jessica documented every moment with her professional-grade camera, creating a behind-the-scenes album that would complement the official wedding photos. Lily, always the comedian, kept everyone laughing with her running commentary on wedding traditions and marriage advice. 2 hours before the ceremony, our parents arrived to see Emma in her completed look. Mom's reaction was everything a bride could hope for: tears, gasps of delight, and endless compliments about how beautiful her daughter looked. Dad, typically more reserved with emotions, seemed genuinely moved as he took in the sight of his little girl transformed into a bride. "You look absolutely perfect," Mom said, carefully embracing Emma to avoid disturbing her dress or makeup. "Michael is going to lose his mind when he sees you walking down that aisle." The photographer captured these family moments with artistic precision, directing us through various poses that would become treasured memories. During one group shot of Emma with our parents, I noticed Dad seemed unusually tense, his smile looking forced despite the joyful occasion. When I caught his eye, he looked away quickly, focusing intently on adjusting his tie. Michael's family had arrived from San Diego the previous evening, and they fit seamlessly into the wedding celebration. His parents, Roberto and Carmen Rodriguez, were warm and welcoming, treating our family like longtime friends, despite having met only a few times previously. Michael's sister, Sophia, was serving as one of his groomsmen, breaking tradition in a way that perfectly reflected the couple's modern approach to wedding planning. The ceremony itself was scheduled for 4 o'clock, followed by cocktail hour during golden hour photography, then dinner and dancing under the stars. Emma had spent months perfecting every detail, from the custom cocktail menu featuring drinks named after significant moments in her relationship with Michael, to the playlist that would guide guests through an evening of celebration.
As we prepared for the processional, Emma pulled me aside for a private moment away from the other bridesmaids and family members. Her expression was serious, almost somber, which seemed odd given the celebratory atmosphere surrounding us. "Ayla, I need to tell you something," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Something I should have told you a long time ago." Before she could continue, our wedding coordinator appeared to announce that it was time for the processional to begin. Emma's revelation would have to wait, but the urgency in her voice left me feeling unsettled as we lined up for our entrance. The ceremony was everything Emma had envisioned: romantic, personal, and meaningful.
Michael's vows brought tears to everyone's eyes as he spoke about finding his perfect partner and gaining not just a wife, but an entire extended family. Emma's vows were equally moving, though I noticed she kept glancing at our parents during certain passages, as if seeking their approval or reassurance. The reception began with cocktails on the terrace overlooking the valley, giving guests time to mingle and enjoy the spectacular views while the wedding party completed photography sessions. The photographer worked efficiently, capturing the standard family combinations as well as more creative shots that would showcase the venue's natural beauty. During dinner, the atmosphere was relaxed and joyful. Our parents had worked with Emma to create a seating arrangement that facilitated conversation and ensured everyone felt included. I was seated at the head table with the other bridesmaids and groomsmen, perfectly positioned to observe the celebration while fulfilling my maid of honor duties. The meal was exceptional, locally sourced ingredients prepared by the venue's acclaimed chef, paired with wines from nearby Napa Valley vineyards. Conversation flowed easily between courses, with guests sharing stories about Emma and Michael's relationship and offering marriage advice, both serious and humorous. As dinner concluded and servers began clearing tables for dancing, our father stood to deliver the traditional father of the bride speech. His remarks were heartfelt and appropriate, focusing on Emma's character, her accomplishments, and his approval of Michael as a son-in-law. He spoke about watching Emma grow from a precocious little girl into an accomplished young woman who had found her perfect partner. Michael's father followed with equally warm remarks about gaining a daughter through marriage and expressing gratitude for the Thompson family's welcome. The speeches were touching without being overly sentimental, setting the perfect tone for the evening's continued celebration. Then came my moment as maid of honor. I had spent weeks crafting a speech that balanced humor with emotion, sharing stories about Emma's childhood dreams of her perfect wedding, her relationship with Michael, and the qualities that made her such an extraordinary sister and friend. I felt confident and prepared as I stood to address the gathered guests. "Good evening, everyone," I began, my voice carrying clearly through the sound system. "For those who don't know me, I'm Isla, Emma's sister and maid of honor." The opening lines went smoothly as I shared amusing anecdotes about Emma's childhood obsession with wedding planning, her elaborate dress-up games that always ended with makeshift ceremonies in our backyard, and her detailed notebook of wedding ideas that she'd been maintaining since she was 12 years old. "Emma has always known exactly what she wanted," I continued, warming to my theme. "She's the kind of person who makes decisions with her heart and sticks to them with unwavering determination. When she told our family about Michael, we knew immediately that this was different, that she had found something special." The speech was going perfectly, with guests laughing at appropriate moments and nodding in recognition of the qualities I was describing. Emma was beaming, tears of happiness glistening in her eyes as I spoke about our sisterhood and the joy of watching her find such obvious happiness with Michael. "What many of you might not know," I said, transitioning to what I intended to be the emotional climax of my speech, "is that Emma and I weren't always sisters. She came into our family when she was just 3 days old, and I was lucky enough to be chosen as her big sister through adoption." The words left my mouth before I fully processed what I was saying. In my mind, I was sharing a touching story about a chosen family and the bonds that transcend biology. But as I looked out at the sea of faces staring back at me, I realized that the collective gasp from the audience was not one of touching emotion, but of shock and confusion. Emma's face had gone completely white, her mouth forming a perfect O of horror. Our parents looked like they'd been struck by lightning, Mom's hand flying to her throat, while Dad gripped his wine glass so tightly I thought it might shatter. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the soft background music that continued playing, despite the fact that time seemed to have stopped completely. I stammered, suddenly understanding that I had made a catastrophic mistake. I mean, from somewhere in the crowd, I heard Michael's confused voice asking, "What's happening?" while wedding guests began murmuring to each other in bewildered whispers. The photographer, professional to the core, continued capturing the moment, even as the celebration transformed into something entirely different.
Emma found her voice first, though it came out as barely more than a whisper amplified by the microphone system. "Ayla," she said, her voice breaking, "I was adopted, not you." The correction hit me like a physical blow. The room began spinning as the full magnitude of my error sank in. I had revealed my sister's adoption secret to 200 wedding guests based on a fundamental misunderstanding of our family's truth. But even as I grappled with this realization, I knew that Emma's correction raised more questions than it answered. If Emma was adopted, why had I spent years questioning my own place in the family? Why were there so few photos of my early childhood? Why did relatives make carefully worded comments about how our family had come together? And most importantly, why had this information been kept secret for so long? Mom's voice cut through the confusion, sharp and desperate. "Girls, perhaps we should discuss this privately." But it was too late for privacy. The revelation had been made in the most public way possible, in front of family, friends, and colleagues who were now witnesses to a family secret that had been carefully guarded for 25 years. The wedding reception had transformed into something none of us had anticipated, and there was no way to take back the words that had already been spoken. As I stood frozen at the microphone, still holding my prepared speech that had become completely irrelevant, I realized that this moment would divide our family's history into two distinct periods: before the truth was revealed and everything that would come after. The celebration Emma had planned so carefully was over, replaced by a reckoning that none of us were prepared to face. The 20 minutes following my disastrous speech were a blur of damage control that felt more like a crisis management exercise than a wedding celebration. Michael, to his credit, immediately stepped forward to support his new wife, wrapping his arms around Emma as she stood frozen in shock. The wedding coordinator, a professional who had clearly dealt with unexpected situations before, quickly directed the DJ to resume music at a volume that encouraged conversation and movement. Most guests, sensing the family needed space, graciously migrated toward the bar or stepped outside to admire the venue's gardens. A few close family members lingered uncertainly, unsure whether to approach or maintain respectful distance. Michael's parents exchanged worried glances but remained seated, clearly recognizing this was Thompson family business that required privacy. Emma finally broke free from her paralysis, grabbing my arm with surprising strength. "We need to talk," she said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "All of us, right now." Our parents, who had been whispering urgently to each other, nodded in agreement. Dad's face had taken on the grayish pallor I remembered from his minor heart episode 3 years earlier, while Mom looked like she was fighting between flight and fight responses. The wedding coordinator, a professional who had clearly dealt with unexpected situations before, quickly directed the DJ to resume music at a volume that encouraged conversation and movement. Most guests, sensing the family needed space, graciously migrated toward the bar or stepped outside to admire the venue's gardens. A few close family members lingered uncertainly, unsure whether to approach or maintain respectful distance. Michael's parents exchanged worried glances but remained seated, clearly recognizing this was Thompson family business that required privacy. Emma finally broke free from her paralysis, grabbing my arm with surprising strength. "We need to talk," she said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "All of us, right now." Our parents, who had been whispering urgently to each other, nodded in agreement. Dad's face had taken on the grayish pallor I remembered from his minor heart episode 3 years earlier, while Mom looked like she was fighting between flight and fight responses. The wedding coordinator quickly arranged for us to use the venue's private library, a quiet space away from the reception where we could have an uninterrupted conversation. The library felt surreal after the festive atmosphere of the reception. Heavy wooden furniture and floor-to-ceiling bookshelves created an academic atmosphere that seemed inappropriate for wedding attire.
Emma's elaborate dress rustled against the leather chairs as she positioned herself across from our parents, while I remained standing near the door, still holding my abandoned speech notes. 25 years, Emma said, her voice barely controlled. 25 years you've let me believe Ayla was my biological sister while hiding the truth about my own origins. Mom's composure finally cracked completely. We were protecting you, she said through sobs. We wanted you to feel completely secure in your place in our family. We never wanted you to feel different or question whether you belonged. By lying to me, Emma's voice rose despite her obvious efforts to maintain control. By creating an elaborate fiction about my birth and early childhood. By letting me live my entire life believing something that wasn't true. Dad, who had remained silent since leaving the reception, finally spoke up. We thought it was better for you not to know. The social workers recommended it back then. They said children adjusted better when they could grow up without the complications of adoption identity issues. What social workers? I asked, my journalistic instincts kicking in despite the emotional chaos. What were the circumstances of Emma's adoption? The question seemed to hit our parents like a physical blow. They exchanged another one of their meaningful looks, the kind of silent communication that comes from decades of marriage and shared secrets. When Mom finally answered, her voice was barely audible. Emma's biological mother was very young, she said carefully. She wasn't able to care for a baby, and she wanted Emma to have opportunities she couldn't provide. It was a private adoption, arranged through a lawyer. How young? Demanded. What were her circumstances? Do I have biological siblings? What medical history should I know about? Each question seemed to cause our parents additional distress. Dad loosened his tie and took several deep breaths before responding. She was 16 when you were born, a runaway from an abusive home situation. She specifically requested a closed adoption because she didn't want any possibility of her family finding you.
The information was devastating in its implications. Emma had spent her entire life believing she was born into a loving, stable family, when in reality she had been surrendered by a teenager in crisis. The romantic narrative of her birth and early childhood had been completely fabricated to protect her from a much harsher truth. "Where is she now?" Emma asked. "Is she still alive? Does she ever wonder what happened to me?" "We don't know," Mom admitted. "The adoption was closed, which means we have no information about her life after the placement. The lawyer who arranged everything died about 10 years ago, and his records were sealed." Emma stood abruptly, pacing the small room as much as her elaborate dress would allow. "So let me understand this correctly," she said, her voice taking on the sharp edge I recognized from her most stressful moments. "You took in a baby from a teenage mother in crisis, spent 25 years creating a fictional origin story, and never once considered that I might want to know the truth about where I came from?" "We considered it," Dad said defensively, "especially when you were older. But you seemed so happy, so well adjusted. We were afraid that telling you might create problems that didn't need to exist." "That wasn't your decision to make," Emma exploded, her carefully maintained composure finally shattering completely. "You stole my right to know my own history. You made decisions about my identity without consulting me. How is that protecting me?" The accusation hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. I found myself caught between supporting my sister and trying to understand our parents' perspective. The social worker training and research I'd done for my journalism assignment suggested that adoption practices in the late 1990s were indeed different from current standards, with more emphasis on assimilation and less on maintaining biological connections. "What about me?" I asked, the question I'd been harboring for years finally finding its voice. If Emma was adopted, why did I spend my entire college career feeling like something was wrong with my place in the family? This question seemed to surprise everyone, including Emma. Our parents looked genuinely confused by my concern, while Emma stared at me with an expression I couldn't interpret. "What do you mean?" Mom asked.
"You're our biological daughter. You were born at Riverside General on March 15th, 1995, after 18 hours of labor that I will never forget." "Then why are there so few pictures of me as a baby?" I pressed. "Why do relatives make weird comments about how our family came together? Why did Grandpa Joe mention my homecoming last Christmas?" Dad's expression shifted from confusion to understanding. "Oh, honey," he said, his voice filled with something that might have been a relief. "You were born prematurely. You spent the first 6 weeks of your life in the NICU at Riverside General. We barely left the hospital, and photography was the last thing on our minds." The explanation was so simple, so logical, that I felt embarrassed for having questioned it. Of course there would be fewer baby pictures if I'd been hospitalized for the first weeks of my life. Of course relatives would make comments about homecomings and family completions when referring to a premature baby finally coming home healthy. The comments from relatives were about you surviving and thriving after such a difficult start, Mom added, and about how perfect our family felt once both our daughters were healthy and home where they belonged. Emma had stopped pacing and was staring at me with an expression of dawning realization. "You thought you were adopted too?" she said. "All these years, you've been questioning your place in the family while I was completely oblivious to mine." The irony was almost unbearable. I had spent years doubting my biological connection to our family, while Emma, who actually was adopted, had never questioned her place. We had been living parallel experiences of uncertainty and belonging, each unaware of the other's struggles. "This is insane," Emma said, her voice breaking again. "Our entire family dynamic has been built on lies and misunderstandings. Ayla's been questioning her identity unnecessarily, while I've been living in complete ignorance of mine." A knock on the library door interrupted our conversation. Michael's voice came through the wood, gentle but concerned. "Emma, the guests are starting to ask questions. Should I make some kind of announcement, or would you prefer to end the reception?" The question forced us back to immediate reality. Emma's wedding reception was continuing without the bride, and 200 guests were undoubtedly speculating about what had transpired during my speech. Emma looked around at our family, her expression cycling through anger, hurt, and exhaustion. "I need to think about this," she said finally. "I need time to process everything before I can face all those people and pretend to be celebrating." She moved toward the door, then paused and turned back to our parents. "We're going to continue this conversation tomorrow. Michael and I are supposed to leave for our honeymoon in Belize on Tuesday, but that's not happening until we resolve this completely." "Emma, please don't let this ruin your wedding night," Mom pleaded. "We can work through this, but tonight should be about you and Michael."
Emma's laugh was bitter and sharp. My wedding night was ruined the moment I learned that my maid of honor speech revealed family secrets I didn't even know existed. Tonight is about damage control, not celebration. She opened the door and stepped out, leaving the three of us alone with the weight of 25 years of carefully guarded secrets now exposed. Dad slumped in his chair, looking older than I'd ever seen him, while Mom continued crying quietly into her hands. "How do we fix this?" I asked, though I suspected the answer was far more complicated than any of us were prepared to handle. "I don't know if we can," Dad replied honestly. "Some things, once broken, can't be put back together the same way." Outside the library, we could hear the sounds of the reception winding down earlier than planned, guests making polite excuses and heading to their cars. Emma's perfect wedding had become the day our family's carefully constructed facade finally collapsed, leaving us all to figure out how to rebuild from the wreckage of secrets that should have been shared years ago. The hardest part was knowing that this was just the beginning. Tomorrow would bring more difficult conversations, and within 48 hours, Child Protective Services would knock on our parents' door, alerted by a wedding guest who recognized the signs of a family in crisis and suspected there might be more to the story than what we'd revealed. The knock on our parents' door came exactly 48 hours after the wedding disaster, just as Emma and I were sitting down with Mom and Dad for what we'd planned as our final family meeting before her rescheduled honeymoon departure.
Michael had returned to Los Angeles to handle work obligations, giving Emma space to process everything with the family before they could start their married life with a clean slate. Detective Sarah Martinez and social worker Kevin Chen stood on the front porch, their official credentials and serious expressions immediately signaling that our family crisis had attracted unwanted attention. Behind them was Dr. Patricia Reeves, a child psychologist whose presence suggested this visit was about more than routine follow-up. Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, Detective Martinez began, we received a report concerning possible irregularities in an adoption that took place 25 years ago. We need to speak with you about Emma Rodriguez, formerly Emma Thompson. The formal use of Emma's married name felt jarring, as if the authorities had already begun separating her from our family identity. Dad invited them inside with the resignation of someone who had been expecting this moment for decades, while Mom's face went ashen as she realized their carefully guarded secret was now subject to official scrutiny. Emma stood to introduce herself, her voice steady despite the obvious stress of the situation. I'm Emma Rodriguez. I understand there are questions about my adoption, and I want to cooperate fully with your investigation. Dr. Reeves took the lead in explaining their presence. We received information suggesting that your adoption may not have been conducted through proper legal channels. When adoptions involve underage birth parents, especially those from potentially abusive situations, we have a responsibility to verify that all procedures were followed correctly. The next 3 hours unfolded like a carefully choreographed interrogation, with each family member being interviewed separately before being brought together for group discussions. The authorities' questions were thorough and professional, but their implications were devastating for our family's sense of security and identity. The investigation revealed details about Emma's adoption that our parents had never shared, some of which they claimed not to have known themselves. Emma's birth mother, Jennifer Walsh, had indeed been 16 and from an abusive home, but the circumstances surrounding her pregnancy and the adoption placement were more complex than the simplified version we'd been told. Jennifer had been living in a group home for runaway teens when she became pregnant. The baby's father was never identified, and there were questions about whether the pregnancy resulted from the abuse she'd fled. The lawyer who arranged the adoption, Thomas Brennan, had specialized in what were then called gray market adoptions, legal but with minimal oversight and documentation. The concerning element, Detective Martinez explained, is that Mr. Brennan was investigated multiple times for failing to follow proper notification procedures. In several cases, he placed children without ensuring that biological father's rights were properly terminated. Emma absorbed this information with the clinical detachment she'd developed over the past 2 days, but I could see the emotional toll it was taking. Every new detail about her origins contradicted the narrative of loving intention and careful planning that our parents had maintained for 25 years. The most shocking revelation came when Kevin Chen produced a file folder containing documents our family had never seen. We located Jennifer Walsh, he announced, causing Emma to gasp audibly. The silence in our living room was deafening. Emma's birth mother was not only alive, but had been actively searching for the daughter she'd surrendered as a desperate teenager. The closed adoption that our parents believed was permanent and final was one-sided, with Jennifer never agreeing to cut all ties.
She lives in Sacramento now, Dr. Reeves added gently. She's married, has 2 other children, and works as a social worker specializing in teen pregnancy prevention. She's been registered with reunion databases since Emma turned 18, hoping for contact. Emma's composure finally broke completely. "She's been looking for me?" she whispered through tears. "For 15 years, she's been wondering if I'm okay, wanting to know me, while I had no idea she even existed beyond the story of a troubled teenager who couldn't care for me?" Our parents' expressions reflected the full weight of the choices they'd made decades earlier. Mom's face showed genuine anguish as she realized the unintended consequences of their decision to maintain complete secrecy about Emma's origins. "We thought we were protecting you," Dad said, his voice breaking. "We believed that not knowing would spare you from feeling torn between 2 families or questioning your place with us."
"You stole 25 years from both of us," Emma replied, her anger finally surfacing. "You robbed me of the chance to know where I came from, and you robbed her of knowing that her daughter was safe and loved." The investigation continued for several more weeks, but no criminal charges were filed. While Brennan's adoption practices had been questionable, Emma's placement with our family had been legal and properly documented. The primary concern was the emotional harm caused by withholding information about Jennifer's desire for contact. During this period, Emma made the courageous decision to reach out to Jennifer Walsh through the social worker's office. Their first phone conversation lasted 3 hours, followed by weeks of daily calls as they shared their respective life stories and began building a relationship that bridged the 25-year gap. Jennifer's story was both heartbreaking and inspiring. After placing Emma for adoption, she had struggled with addiction and homelessness before eventually getting clean and earning her GED. She'd married at 25, had 2 children, and channeled her experiences into helping other young women facing unplanned pregnancies. Her search for Emma had been motivated not by regret about the adoption decision, but by a desire to know that her daughter was thriving and to share medical history information. "She never wanted to disrupt my life," Emma explained to me during one of our long conversations. "She just wanted to know I was okay and to be available if I ever wanted contact. All these years, she's respected the adoption while hoping for a reunion." The relationship between Emma and Jennifer developed cautiously but steadily. They met in person 6 weeks after their first phone call, with Michael and me providing emotional support. The meeting was emotional but positive, marked by physical similarities that were unmistakable and personality traits that suggested genetic connections despite the years of separation. Our parents struggled significantly with Emma's reunion with her birth mother. They had spent 25 years believing they were Emma's only true family, and Jennifer's presence forced them to confront the reality that love and family connections can exist in multiple forms simultaneously. The most difficult conversation came when Emma announced her intention to change her last name to include both families, Emma Thompson Rodriguez Walsh. The hyphenated name honored her adoptive family, her married name, and her birth family, representing the complex identity she was learning to embrace. "I'm not choosing one family over another," she explained to our parents. "I'm claiming all the parts of who I am. You raised me, loved me, and shaped who I became. Jennifer gave me life and made the hardest decision a mother can make. Michael is my chosen partner for the future. I want to honor all of those connections." The healing process was gradual and sometimes painful. Family therapy sessions helped us navigate the complex emotions surrounding adoption, identity, and the consequences of well-intentioned secrecy. Dr. Williams, our family therapist, helped us understand that while our parents' motivations had been loving, the results had caused unintended harm that required acknowledgement and repair. Emma's relationship with Jennifer continued to deepen, but rather than replacing our family connection, it seemed to enhance her capacity for love and belonging. She learned about medical history that explained some health issues she'd experienced, discovered she had 2 half-siblings who welcomed her enthusiastically, and gained insight into personality traits that finally made sense. The most profound change was in Emma herself. The uncertainty and questions she'd carried unconsciously for years were replaced by a solid sense of identity that incorporated all aspects of her story. She no longer felt the need to be perfect or prove her belonging in our family because she understood that love and family are choices that transcend biology. Our family dynamics evolved significantly as well. The crisis had forced all of us to confront assumptions about family, truth, and protection that we'd never examined. Mom and Dad began attending support groups for adoptive parents, learning about openness and honesty in adoption relationships. They slowly developed a relationship with Jennifer that was initially awkward, but gradually became mutually respectful. 2 years later, Emma's second wedding anniversary celebration included both families, a testament to the healing that had taken place and the expanded definition of family we'd all learned to embrace. Jennifer was there with her husband and children. Our parents had learned to welcome her presence, and the children who had once been strangers were now Emma's beloved half-siblings. My own journey through this experience taught me valuable lessons about assumptions, truth, and the importance of asking direct questions rather than living with uncertainty. The most unexpected outcome was how the crisis strengthened rather than destroyed our family bonds. By confronting the truth about Emma's adoption and the impact of decades-old secrets, we learned to communicate more honestly and love more openly. The perfect family facade we'd maintained for years was replaced by something more authentic and ultimately more resilient. Emma's adoption story became a catalyst for broader conversations about family, identity, and the importance of honoring all aspects of a person's history. She began speaking at adoption conferences, sharing her experience and advocating for openness and honesty in adoption relationships. "Secrets don't protect children," she would tell audiences. "Truth, shared with love and support, gives children the foundation they need to understand themselves completely." The wedding speech that had seemed like such a disaster ultimately became the moment our family learned to embrace truth over comfort, complexity, and authentic love over protective lies. Today, our family includes more people, more stories, and more love than we ever imagined possible. The Maid of Honor speech that revealed Emma's adoption didn't destroy our family. It expanded it beyond anything we thought possible and taught us that the strongest families are built on truth, acceptance, and the courage to embrace complexity rather than hide from it. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.